Meslier and his Testament. Bevolking. Section 1. Meslier's singular position in 18th century thought. Valjean immediately establishes Jean Meslier not merely as a participant in the French Enlightenment, but as one of its most radical and unique progenitors. While the 18th century had many proponents of social equality and many critics of the church, Valjean argues that Meslier was singular on two fronts, from theory to revolution. Unlike other utopian thinkers, Meslier's communism was not a passive intellectual exercise. He uniquely combined the ideal of communal property with a direct, impassioned call for the oppressed masses to unite and wage a revolutionary struggle against their oppressors. Atheism as a class weapon. While many of his contemporaries were deists or critics of organized religion, Meslier's atheism was exceptional. He wielded it as a direct instrument of struggle against the basic principles of class society. Valjean stresses that Meslier's worldview cannot be understood apart from his life, which was wholly embedded in the rural world. Born in the village of Mazerny in Champagne in 1664, he served his entire career as a priest in Étrepigny. The defining moment of his quiet life was a public act of rebellion. He furiously denounced the local feudal lord from his own church pulpit, earning a sharp rebuke from his ecclesiastical superiors. This experience is key. For Valjean, the poverty and suffering of the oppressed village is the fundamental context and emotional core of the Testament. Section 2. The Crucible of Suffering. France at the turn of the 18th century. Valjean argues that the Testament is a direct product of one of the most desperate periods in the history of the French peasantry. To illustrate this, he marshals evidence from multiple contemporary sources. La Bruyère's devastating portrait. Valjean quotes the writer La Bruyère's famous description of the peasantry from the end of Louis XIV reign. La Bruyère describes seeing certain wild animals, male and female, with swarthy, livid skin, who are attached to the land which they dig, with an invincible stubbornness. He notes that they have something like articulate speech, and, when they stand up, reveal a human face. He concludes with bitter irony that these creatures, who spare others the labor of sowing and reaping, surely deserve not to lack that bread which they have sown. Official reports of collapse. This was not just literary hyperbole. Valjean cites a 1687 report from the king's own commissioners, who, despite their initial skepticism, were convinced by the facts of a profound rural collapse. They observed decaying houses, peasants selling off their small plots, the disappearance of prosperous farmers, and their replacement by poor sharecroppers, half-beggars, burdened by insurmountable debt. In many places, peasants were reduced to eating fern roots mixed with barley or oat flour. The twin engines of oppression, feudal exploitation. Valjean contends that most contemporary observers, often belonging to the nobility themselves, incorrectly blamed only government taxes for this crisis. They overlooked the fundamental contradiction of the feudal village, the contradiction between the peasant and the landlord exploiting him. This was especially true in Meslier's home province of Champagne, where serfdom and other archaic feudal duties persisted with particular cruelty right up to the 1789 revolution. For Meslier, there was no question. The seigneur, feudal lord, was the peasant's worst enemy. The absolute estate, the tax and commercial policies of Louis XIV government then extracted any remaining wealth from the village after the feudal lords had taken their share. The burden of the state's expenses fell almost entirely on the peasantry, becoming unbearable by the late 17th century. This pressure led not only to passive resistance, requiring military detachments to collect taxes, but to a series of open and widespread peasant uprisings. This socio-political environment of extreme exploitation and simmering rebellion was the fertile ground from which the Testament grew. Section 3. The author and his work, Erudition and Final Confession. Valjean then examines the intellectual resources Meslier drew upon and the profound personal motivation for writing the Testament. A well-stocked mind. Despite his isolation, Meslier was exceptionally well-read, thanks to his seminary education. The Bible. His most frequently cited text is the Bible. He treats it dually. On one hand, it is a book filled with stupid, ridiculous, and harmful tales. On the other, he skillfully quotes passages that align with his own ideas, particularly from the book of Ecclesiastes, to bolster his arguments. Classical and modern authors. After the Bible, he most often cites Latin and Greek authors, favoring the Romans. The materialist poet Lucretius is one of his most revered writers. He also cites Ovid's description of the Golden Age with sympathy and was familiar with Virgil, Lucian, Livy, and Tacitus. He knew French philosophy well enough to dedicate entire chapters to refuting Descartes and Malebranche. Among secular French writers, Montaigne is his most frequently cited, treated as an almost infallible authority. He was also familiar with political writers like Fenelon and Philippe de Comines, and kept up with contemporary literature despite his circumstances. A posthumous declaration of truth. Valjean emphasizes the deeply personal and dramatic context of the book's creation. Meslier wrote it in old age, knowing his end was near. According to a plausible version of events, he took his own life. After a lifetime of performing priestly duties that he found repugnant, he felt empowered by his impending death to finally speak the truth he had long meditated upon. The book is framed as a posthumous letter. He writes in the introduction, "My dear friends, I could not tell you during my lifetime what I think, and decided to share my thoughts with you after my death." He concludes on the same note of finality, stating that he is already among the dead and is unconcerned with what the living may say or do to him for having dared to speak the truth. Section 4. The Grand Critique, Society, State, and Their Evils. Here, Valjean unpacks the core of Meslier's radical critique, which is aimed not just at contemporary France, but at the very foundations of class society. First evil, the disproportionate distribution of goods. Meslier attacks the existence of social classes, where one group seems born to tyrannically dominate, and another to be miserable slaves. He fiercely denies that this is based on merit, stating that the ancestors of the nobility were nothing more than bloodthirsty and cruel tyrants, traitors, thieves, parricides, whose violent seizures of property are euphemistically called conquests. He posits a natural law of equality. All people have an equal right to life, liberty, and the fruits of the earth obtained through useful labor. Any dependency that elevates some and degrades others is unjust and hateful. In one of the most powerful passages paraphrased by Valjean, Meslier tells his parishioners they are told to fear devils, but the real devils are not ugly monsters. The real devils, the true enemies of mankind, are the nobles, the great, and the rich. He insists they should be depicted as beautiful gentlemen or lovely ladies, powdered, curled, and glittering with gold, silver, and precious stones, for their evil is entirely real, unlike the imaginary demons of the preachers. Second evil, the masses of parasites. Meslier condemns the vast number of people who live off the labor of the people while being completely useless or even actively harmful to them. He includes in this group not just beggars, but rich idlers, the clergy, especially the wealthy, non-working abbots, monks, and canons, and a whole host of state agents, jurists, tax collectors, and scoundrels and swindlers of the salt and tobacco supervision. He points out the supreme irony that the rich claim they do not need to work because of their income, but their wealth brings income only thanks to the labor of other people. Critique of absolute monarchy. Meslier's position is uncompromising. All kings are tyrants. They see their own will as sufficient reason for their commands. He specifically targets Louis XIV, stating that no king was ever so absolute or brought so much misery. He mocks the title the Great, arguing it was earned not for praiseworthy deeds, but for the great injustices, great devastations, great murders of which he was the culprit. Repeating the formula of earlier tyrant fighters, monarchomics, he asserts that rulers are made for the people, not the people for rulers. He concludes that revolutions are not caused by the people's well-being, as tyrants claim, but by their suffering, for which the kings themselves are always to blame. Valjean concludes this section by emphasizing Meslier's unique radicalism. He sought not reform, but the complete eradication of the feudal absolutist order. His work is saturated with a truly revolutionary pathos, born not from books, but from his life experience in the oppressed village. Section 5. The Blueprint for a New World. Utopian Communism. Volgin details how Meslier's critique leads directly to a positive program for a new society, one that attacks the pillars of both feudalism and the emerging bourgeois order. Private property as the primal sin. Meslier identifies the private ownership of wealth as a fundamental evil. It unleashes insatiable greed and a vicious struggle where the strongest, most cunning, most agile, and often the most evil seize everything. This creates a world of obscene inequality, which he describes as paradise and hell existing side by side. Some live in bliss and abundance, while others suffer in a real hell on earth. The communist alternative, communal ownership and equality. The foundational principle is that people must own all the goods and riches of the earth in common and on equal terms, and use them also in common and equally. The parish commune. The basic social unit would be the parish or town, where all inhabitants would constitute a single family. They would share similar food, housing, and clothing, and all would be obliged to work according to their abilities. These communes would form voluntary alliances for mutual aid, free union, and communal child-rearing. Meslier advocates for the abolition of indissoluble marriage. Men and women should be completely free in their sexual relations, able to separate and form new unions based on mutual attraction. Children would be cared for, educated, and raised at the expense of the community, which would instill in them virtue and useful knowledge. The fruits of communism. The results, Meslier predicts, would be astonishing. With no private property, vices like theft, robbery, and greed would disappear. Since everyone would work, the burden of labor on each individual would be drastically reduced. People would live happier and work less, and could even live in luxury if they chose. Volgin explicitly contrasts this with the asceticism of other thinkers like Rousseau, noting that Meslier's vision is entirely alien to Christian self-denial. Section 6. The Revolutionary Path. How to Achieve the New World. Volgin explains that Meslier was not a passive dreamer, but a theorist of revolution. The conspiracy of power, state, and religion. Meslier asks how such an unjust system is maintained by a minority over a majority. His answer is the close union of two types of liars, the clergy and secular rulers. The state provides the direct violence. Religion provides the ideological justification. It is a cunning lie used to fool the people into voluntarily accepting their enslavement. He states bluntly, religion supports a government than which there can be none worse. The government supports a religion than which there can be none more stupid. The pillars of tyranny, ignorance and division. The oppressed tolerate this system because they are ignorant and disunited. They are deliberately held in a net of delusions and lack the solidarity needed for a struggle. The call to action. The path forward is clear. Enlightenment. The duty of all intelligent people is to enlighten the masses, to free them from religious superstition, and instill in them a hatred and contempt for the powers that be. Solidarity and passive resistance. Meslier issues a stirring call for unity. Unite then, peoples. Help one another. He argues that the people are the source of all wealth and power. To dry up the roots of tyranny, they must simply stop giving their labor and resources to their oppressors. Give nothing to the proud and useless idlers. To the nobles who despise you. To the tyrants who oppress you. If their children and friends refuse to serve as soldiers and agents, the entire system will wither and die. Tyrannicide. He goes further, explicitly justifying tyrannicide and praising figures like Brutus and Cassius, as well as the religious fanatics Jacques Clement and Ravaillac, assassins of French kings, whom he recasts as martyrs who died for the happiness of their country. Volgin notes that this praise clearly shows the influence of the 16th century Catholic monarchomaque writers. Section 7. The Philosophical Bedrock, Materialism and Atheism. Volgin demonstrates that Meslier's entire social and political system rests on a coherent and radical materialist philosophy that predates the more famous French materialists like Holbach. The primacy of matter. The world exists, and it is eternal. This eternal being is matter. Matter is the first cause of all things. It moves by itself, and everything in the universe, from stars to life, can be explained by the natural laws of motion and the combination of its parts. The idea of a creator God creating the world from nothing is an absurdity that contradicts reason. The material soul. Since matter is the only reality, the human soul must also be material. Meslier conceives of it as a quantity of very fine, light, and mobile matter. Thought is simply an internal motion or modification of this matter. He argues forcefully against the dualism of Descartes, pointing to the undeniable connection between the physical brain and consciousness. Take away all our organs. And what will remain of our life? Where will our thoughts, our sufferings, and our pleasures be? Of course, they will not exist at all. Consequently, he categorically rejects the immortality of the soul, arguing it simply disintegrates with the body. Volgen notes the clear and acknowledged influence of the ancient Roman materialist Lucretius on these ideas. The problem of evil as the ultimate refutation of God. Volgen highlights one argument that perfectly bridges Meslier's social and philosophical thought. The world is filled with undeniable evil, both physical disease, death, and moral vice, suffering, injustice. An all-powerful and infinitely good God could not and would not create a world containing such flaws. The theological justifications for evil, that it is a punishment for sin or a test of virtue, are pathetic rationalizations. An omnipotent God could achieve his aims without resorting to the tool of evil. Therefore, Meslier's conclusion is stark and logical. If there is evil, then there is no God. Volgen's conclusion. The significance of Jean Meslier. Volgen concludes that the Testament is a remarkable work of integrity and consistency. Its communism, revolutionary politics, atheism, and materialism are not separate ideas, but form a single, seamless worldview, fused together by a powerful hatred for the evil that reigns in the world. He sees Meslier as a direct forerunner of the revolutionary communists of the French Revolution, like Babeuf. But more importantly, Volgen frames the Testament as a vital symptom, a unique window into the revolutionary sentiments and social aspirations that were forming in the depths of the rural poor. It is a document that captures the subterranean currents that would, half a century later, erupt to the surface and violently overthrow the feudal order and the absolute monarchy.